So we're welcoming everyone to this day 2, and today's the first panelist is Mel Farrell, the director of the Irish Humanities Alliance. And so thank you very much, Mel.
Thank you very much, Brendan. And I'd just like to formally welcome all our delegates to day 2 of the Exciting News Event Narration and Impact from Past to Present conference, which of course is the annual Irish Humanities Alliance conference, which this year is run in partnership with the Euronews project in UCC. Now, we had a fantastic day yesterday, and today's programme looks like another day of stimulating discussion is in store for all of us. Indeed, today's schedule is even tighter than yesterday's. We have an extra panel on today. So to make sure that we don't lose control of the timetable, I will be quite strict in terms of time with the speakers, and also in terms of the Q&A. So there'll be about 10-15 minutes for Q&A after the 3 panelists have spoken. And of course, just on the Q&A, if you have a question, just pop it into the chat and we will pick it up at the end after the 3 panelists have concluded. And of course, you can also raise your hand here virtually on Zoom. Just a short reminder as well, if you're joining the discussion on Twitter, we're using the hashtag #ExcitingNews2021, and there was some great discussion on Twitter yesterday during the first day of the proceedings. So without further ado, let us get panel 5 underway. And of course, we have 3 excellent speakers on this panel, and we will take them in the order in which they appear on the conference programme. So we have Professor Chris Williams, we have Joel Herman, and we have Dr. Brian Wallace. And again, as was the case yesterday with the chairing of the various panels yesterday, to keep things moving smoothly, I will give short introductions because the full contributor bios are of course available in the conference programme. So first up, we have Professor Chris Williams, who's my boss in the Irish Humanities Alliance. He's the Vice Chair of the IHA, and of course he will be the Chair of the IHA for the next academic year. He's also Professor of History at UCC, and he's also Head of the College of Arts, Celtic Studies and Social Sciences. So Chris, I'll hand you over to the virtual podium.
Thank you very much indeed, Mel. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see, is that going to work? Okay, hopefully you can see that. I'm going to start the slideshow. Great. So I'll get straight into it because I know we're under a little bit of time pressure. By the outbreak of the Great War, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, who you can see on the left here, had spent over 3 decades developing the rigid airship that became known by his family name. Let me just move that down there out the way. In 1907, his craft had completed long-distance trips and caught the imagination of the German public and military establishment. Kaiser Wilhelm hailed the Count as the greatest German of the 20th century, and speculation commenced as to the military possibilities of the airship. H.G. Wells's 1908 novel, The War in the Air, imagined a German Zeppelin fleet reducing New York to rubble. It wasn't stretching credulity very far to imagine the impact Zeppelin raids might have on Britain, and this prospect was captured in a full-page cartoon by Heinrich Clay, you can see on the slide here, in Germany's satirical magazine Simplicissimus. In 1909, British newspapers speculated about airships being used to facilitate a German invasion, generating an airship scare. Now, with the development of the airship came difficult questions about the ramifications for international law when it came to warfare. The 1907 peace conference had agreed that undefended towns should not be bombed from the air, but this left room for interpretation as to what was defended, and it didn't clarify the status of facilities such as dockyards or factories, which might be thought legitimate targets, but the bombing of which would risk civilian lives. But whatever the legal deliberations prior to the war, indiscriminate German strategic bombing of French, Belgian, and then British towns and cities in the early months of the war constituted a major transgression of the accepted norms and provisions of international law. Oops, sorry, let's see, there we go. That early German bombing of places such as Liège, Ostend, Dunkirk, Calais, and then from January 1915, British urban settlements prompted a powerful cartoon by the Australian but London-based artist Will Dyson, Wonders of Science, showing two pickelhaube-wearing apes dropping bombs on what would appear to be a generic but undefended city. This cartoon appeared as part of a collection titled Culture Cartoons, which took a strongly anti-German stance. This specific cartoon was seized on by Lord Rothermere of the Daily Mail, who published it on the Mail's back page on the 1st of January 1915. The historian Adrian Gregory suggested that this cartoon, quote, opened the possibility that the Germans as a people were intrinsically flawed, probably depraved, and possibly evil. The very concept of German culture was constructed by British commentators as the antithesis of civilization, and the tenor of Dyson's entire volume of culture cartoons was profoundly Germanic. Zeppelin raids on Britain began in January 1915. They peaked in 1916, after which time they were increasingly superseded by attacks using Gotha 4 and R Giant multi-engine bombers. There were over 100 air raids launched against British targets during the war, involving the dropping of about 270 tons of bombs and the killing of over 1,200 people, mostly civilians. Compared with the bombing campaigns of later wars, these statistics appear paltry, but at the time, the prospect of death raining down from the air was entirely novel and potentially terrifying. And it's the visual evidence in political and satirical cartoons for anxiety and other reactions among the British public over aerial bombing during the First World War that's the subject of this paper. Now, I started from a base of a big project that I've been running for some time on the political cartoons of a man called J.M. Staniforth, who drew for the Cardiff daily paper, the Western Mail, and for the British Sunday paper, the News of the World, which had the largest circulation, I believe, of any newspaper in the world by the end of the First World War. And for this paper, I've worked outwards from an understanding of Staniforth's dozens of cartoons on the subject to consider the work of a range of other British-based artists, including Will Dyson, including the Dutchman Louis Raymakers, of whom more in a moment, the Punch cartoonist Frank Townsend, the satirical cartoonist William Heath Robinson, and others. Relevant cartoons have been found in both daily and Sunday newspapers, in satirical magazines, in the illustrated press, and in more literary publications such as Land and Water. It's not a comprehensive survey. There's still quite a lot of work to do, but I hope it's a beginning towards an understanding. To my knowledge, no work has considered in any depth the cartoon evidence for British reactions to German air raids during the First World War. Susan Grayzel, in her monograph At Home and Under Fire, Air Raids and Culture in Britain from the Great War to the Blitz, does refer to two Punch cartoons, but these appear to have been encountered in the 1920 retrospective publication, Mr. Punch's History of the Great War, and the extent to which these cartoons are representative even of Punch's responses to aerial bombing is doubtful, because both are whimsical rather than political cartoons. So why cartoons? Well, I think cartoons tell us something about not only cartoonists' own personal understandings of the conflict, but also reveal elements of the wider public response to its vicissitudes. Cartoons, by their very nature, aim to strike a chord with the readers of the newspapers and magazines in which they are published, either resonating in harmony with existing views or challenging commonly held notions by their dissonance. In some measure, they reflect contemporary opinions, unmediated by hindsight, ignorance of how the events they depict will unfold, and prioritizing what appear to be the most pressing questions of the moment. It's the immediacy of the work of cartoonists that is perhaps its most important characteristic. In producing for daily or weekly publications, cartoonists were responding to what they understood to be the rapidly changing nature of the events under scrutiny, with all the limitations in terms of information and perspective that implies. The regularity and the instantaneity of the cartoon gave it something of the quality of a contemporary diary, albeit one written for urgent public consumption. Cartoons being an essentially visual medium, they were particularly appropriate for capturing a vivid range of emotional reactions to the war's key moments. Outrage, apprehension, empathy, anxiety, these sentiments could be expressed, of course, in newspaper editorials, but they were often conveyed very powerfully in graphic form. So my approach is to move beyond seeing cartoons simply as illustrative of broader historical trends or opinions, or as offering only a unilinear message to their readers. One has to guard against anachronistic readings. One has to concentrate on the very specific context in which cartoons appeared, often the details of which have disappeared from the subsequent historiographical record. Yet it is important to note that at least some of the cartoons that reflected on the air war had floated free of their original contextual moorings by the time they reached a British audience. This was particularly the case with the work of the Dutch artist Louis Reymakers, and my apologies if I mangle the pronunciation of any of the Dutch terms. Reymakers' wartime cartoons first appeared in the Amsterdam newspaper De Telegraaf and were republished in collections entitled Het Toppunt der Beschaving, the pinnacle of civilization. By December 1915, his work was being exhibited in London, and the magazine Land and Water republished over 300 Reymakers cartoons in fortnightly instalments running from February 1916, each cartoon accompanied by a commentary penned by intellectuals and public figures, including G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, and John Buchan. These commentaries were very much the author's own responses to the cartoons as viewed at the time, which was some months after they'd first been published in the Netherlands. So this image, the Zeppelin Triumph, for example, appeared in the Netherlands in July 1915, but was issued to Land and Water readers on the 23rd of March 1916. In the original cartoon, Reymakers was probably responding either to raids on Paris or on other French or Belgian cities, or possibly to early raids on London in May and June 1915. But by March 1916, the bombing campaign of Britain had intensified significantly, and the cartoon would have been viewed in Britain in a different light. And the changed reading context is reinforced by the Land and Water commentary supplied by the Oxford philosopher turned Daily Telegraph journalist, W.L. Courtney, who referred specifically to the experience of the last few months, the history of the last few Zeppelin raids in England, the last raid over the Midlands, which would have been at the end of January 1916, and the fact that some of the points of attack are theatres, which was a reference to the bombing of the Lyceum Theatre in Exeter Street, London, in October 1915. A comparable situation in terms of the context in which cartoons have to be understood applies to the work of Heath Robinson. His cartoons often appeared first in various magazines, but were then collected for publication as standalone volumes, Hun Likely in 1916 and The Saintly Hun in 1917. And thus far, I've not been able to locate where these cartoons first appeared. And I think given the highly satirical nature of the Heath Robinson work, this may be less critical. I'm not sure that this cartoon, for instance, is grounded in any specific moment. There are witty comments in general on the Zeppelin threat. But I would argue that cartoons, along with other forms of media communication, were central to how the German aerial threat was experienced by the reading public in Britain. Cartoons allow us to attempt to reconstruct that experience, providing we read them very much in their immediate context and with an eye to decoding the contemporary resonances and meanings that they bore. I think in the context of this conference, they offer evidence of both the visual representation of and the management of public anxiety about civilian vulnerability to air attack and the political and strategic lessons to be drawn from the same. Now, in the time I have available, I'm just going to run through a variety of categories of cartoons, concentrating on the emotional conclusions that can be drawn from them. And I'm just going to give some examples. And these are, inevitably, this is something of a crude analysis, and these categories are by no means watertight. And the cartoons shown range from some explicitly political cartoons at one end of the spectrum to more obviously humorous at the other. So let's begin with moral outrage and condemnation of German culture. The outrage over Zeppelin raids was part of a wider revulsion in Britain and in other allied countries and neutral countries at German methods of conducting the war, which embraced the German shelling in 1914 of Hartlepool and Scarborough, the German U-boat campaign against merchant shipping and passenger liners, including the Lusitania, and the German treatment of Belgian civilians and the destruction of Belgian cultural heritage. Those who were on the receiving end of aerial bombing in Britain were civilians working in their place of work or in their own homes. And in launching such attacks, Germany could be presented as barbaric, immoral, uncivilized, and as committing atrocities. Just to give you two examples of this. So here we have a Louis Raymacher's cartoon, The Zeppelin Raider, published in Land and Water in August 1916. Now its British readership would have picked this up only hours or possibly in the wake of the 6th Zeppelin raid that was made on London, 44 bombs being dropped, killing 22 people, including an 11-year-old girl. The cartoon features Kaiser Wilhelm in the guise of a child murderer, responsible for slitting the throats of 4 sleeping infants. And it was accompanied by a commentary by the Irish-born novelist Henry de Vere Stackpole, at this time living in Essex, very much on the regular Zeppelin flight path into London. Stackpole was a fierce advocate of reprisals for Zeppelin raids, and this was just one of 16 commentaries that he penned for Land and Water's edition of Raymacher's cartoons. Here he pointed out that the cartoon was far less terrible than the reality. Children torn to pieces by high explosives are far more horrible to look at than children with their throats cut. The second example is J.M. Staniforth's Gott mit uns. Again, it targets the Kaiser. It lays responsibility for the killing of children at his door. It appeared shortly after Christmas 1917, likely inspired by the German bombing raid on London of 18th of December, which had left 13 dead and 79 injured. Staniforth, unlike Raymacher's, eschews allegory, but exhibits some restraint in that whilst buildings are devastated, the bodies of the dead children are left intact. Another category then would be anger over the raids and a thirst for vengeance. And I'm just going to show one cartoon on this. It was one thing to be outraged by Zeppelin attacks, but the primitive nature of air defenses, particularly in the early years of the war, meant that it was very difficult to stop Zeppelin raids. By June 1915, there were public calls for attacks on German manufacturing towns in the hope that this might deter future German raids. Isolated British attacks did take place, but it wasn't until late 1917 that there was official acceptance of the need for a planned campaign of British strategic bombing. And in fact, that never really got off the ground properly before the end of the war. Throughout the war, many cartoonists gave vent to their belief that reprisals were justified and necessary. And this is an example from J.M. Staniforth. The Only Way to Stop It is a very clear didactic title. John Bull here, the character in the picture, specifically identifies Essen as a possible target. This cartoon was a response to an intensive German bombing campaign which began on the 24th of September with a mixture of Gotha bombers and Zeppelins attacking targets in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, London, Kent and Essex. As the official history put it, these attacks, quote, remained more vividly than any others in the memory of most of those who lived through the air raids on England. And those attacks are here being contrasted with a British attack on the Jabika aerodrome at Wassenaar, behind the German lines in Belgium, details of which were carried in British newspapers on the 26th of September, which indicated that a large number of bombs were dropped, mostly falling among the sheds and hangars and also among the aeroplanes lined up upon the aerodrome. Staniforth suggests in one of the placards that John Bull is studying, amount of damage unknown, by contrast with the considerable damage done by the German raid in civilian districts. And the placard in the background reminds the reader of the moral turpitude of the German people, in that they express great German joy at the news of London's bombing, this suggesting that they fully deserve to be the target of reciprocal treatment. Now, this anger, this thirst for vengeance could lead to frustration with the authorities' inability to protect British civilians, and indeed frustration with those who advocated pacifist or pacifistic solutions to the conflict. I'm just going to show one cartoon here, which is really aimed at the authorities. The historian of the Great War in the Air, John H. Morrow, notes that throughout 1915, politicians and civilian publicists in Britain were increasingly dissatisfied with and occasionally hysterical about the aerial war effort, and requests for reprisals were a manifestation of this frustration, this impotence. And the cartoon here comments further, I think, on this theme. So this is Frank Townshend's The Letter and the Spirit, and it implicitly accuses Prime Minister David Lloyd George of meaning one thing if saying another. A week before this cartoon appeared, the Evening Mail in London had reported the Prime Minister visiting bombed districts of London after a particularly heavy raid on the night of the 1st, 2nd of October. Quote, "A man shouted, 'Reprisals, Mr. Lloyd George,' on German towns. The cry was received with a shout of approval, and the Prime Minister was heard by those near him to say, 'We shall do that.' In some newspapers, this was reported as Lloyd George saying, 'We'll give it them all back, we'll give them hell, and we'll give it them soon. We shall bomb Germany with compound interest.' Yet simultaneously, reports emerged stating that the Premier was, quote, 'greatly surprised by the vigour of the language attributed to him, and that he had no recollection of using such language.' And Townshend clearly takes this episode as inspiration for his cartoon, showing an interaction between the newsboy and the Prime Minister. The fourth category is that of, you might say, bullish defiance and the celebration of German aerial losses. By late 1916, there was considerable optimism that the Zeppelin was being defeated. A raid launched on the 23rd of September had seen 2 airships shot down, and Frank Townsend again reacts swiftly to the news. His cartoon, A Wasted Life, shows the Kaiser on the left upbraiding Count Zeppelin for not having invented something useful like the tanks. This itself a reference to the first deployment of the tank by the British on the Western Front at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette on the Somme on the 15th of September. And Staniforth's To the Vile Dust from June 1917 also celebrated the downing of a Zeppelin shot down over Suffolk with the loss of 16 of her 19 crew. The title and the caption here are taken from Sir Walter Scott's Lay of the Last Minstrel, and the cartoonist evinces no sympathy for the enemy. Their burning skeletons and dismembered corpses are somewhat gruesomely depicted in the foreground, while the wrecked structure of the airship smoulders behind. But the most common emotion, in my experience, expressed by cartoons on the air war was humour. Humour usually intent on displaying various reactions on a spectrum ranging from cheery stoicism to playful insouciance. And I'll just give you 2 examples. Well, actually, I'm going to show you a photograph, then I'm going to give you 2 examples. So I mentioned before the bombing of the Lyceum Theatre in London. That was the so-called Theatreland raid of October 1915, which inflicted the highest casualties, 71 dead, of a single raid on London, and caused extensive damage to districts of central London, including the Strand, Covent Garden, Chancery Lane, and Hatton Garden. Frank Townsend responded to that raid with this cartoon in early November 1915, picking up on the fact that there was a tendency for interested civilians to come out into the streets to watch the entirely novel spectacle of airships floating high above and dropping bombs. Townsend shows a clearly wealthy couple fascinated and gripped by the prospect of death from the sky. And despite the threat, the cartoonist emphasizes the humor to be found in the situation and the rather foolish sang-froid of the middle-class man and wife. And my last cartoon is by Louis Boehmer from the sketch, 31st of May 1916. Another bourgeois family who clearly narrowly missed death contemplate the upside of having a bomb crater in their garden. Notwithstanding the devastation of their property and the shattering of the glass in the windows and door, the man of the house puffs away at his pipe, his hands in his pockets, while his daughter gazes down in wonder, and it's his wife hitching her dress up to avoid it getting it dirty, who finds the silver lining in this particular cloud. The tranquility of the domestic unit is undisturbed, whatever devastation is hurled from above by the German barbarians. Now, I'm running out of time, so that I'm not going to continue further with the analysis, but in studying cartoon responses to German air raids on Britain, I found that it is the humorous cartoons that I think have most to offer in terms of insights into the public mood. In them, we see captured displays of playful indifference, stoicism, fortitude, doggedness, and phlegm. Susan Grazel has argued the air war gave the opportunity to civilians, especially to women, to demonstrate their stoicism on the home front. And I think we can see some evidence of that in contemporary cartoons. Now, of course, the representation of the public mood can only ever have been partial. Cartoonists self-censored. They were unlikely to seek to have published images that might undermine morale or be seen as defeatist. So they were not going to show the fright that appears to have gripped civilian populations under aerial bombardment at various points during the war. And there were instances of that panic in places like Bath and Barnsley, or in the East End of London at various times. But overall, cartoons drawn in response to German bombing raids on Britain during the First World War should be regarded as a significant source of evidence, I think as at least as important as newspaper editorial columns or letters to the press, probably more revealing than propaganda posters, of how the British public reacted to the novelty and danger of death from the air. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Fascinating paper. I think there will be plenty of questions after that very original and fresh take on the First World War. Okay, our next speaker is Joel Herman, a PhD researcher at Trinity College, Dublin. And Joel's paper will investigate the transnational spread of the news in the late 18th century. So Joel, I'll just call you to the virtual podium. There you are.
Thanks so much. I'm just gonna share my screen quickly. Can you see that? Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the other presenters. That's a tough one to follow. It's great to be able to engage with academic community in the ways that technology has allowed during this time. But yeah, looking forward to a time we can meet in person again. But yeah, to begin, the imperial crisis that broke apart the first British Empire in the late 18th century has been given new focus by a transnational turn. The scholars have begun to uncover connections and reciprocities previously obscured by traditional national historiography. Taking note of the recent and timely call by Stephen Pincus and his co-authors to think the empire whole, this paper begins to think the imperial public sphere whole in the late 18th century, a network of publics linked together through interconnected mediums of information and communication existed and was facilitated by a global empire of trade, commerce, and culture, but was not necessarily hemmed in by imperial boundaries nor controlled by imperial agents. The emergence of the news was critical in this construction. Individuals, communities, and publics in Britain, Ireland, and the American colonies, and eventually the American Republic, were often reading the very same news. Accounts that failed to measure the interplay this allowed between communities, whether intentional or accidental, in what was a transnational empire, are missing important pieces of the puzzle. Using the newspaper accounts of Irish, American, and British newspapers from 1760 to 1780, this paper investigates the news on a transnational level by honing in on 3 episodes in the late 18th century. In doing so, it focuses not only on how these events were reported by the newspaper, but also how this news was distributed and the interplay this allowed between the communities in question. These episodes include the furor surrounding the Stamp Act in 1765-1766, the issuing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and the free trade crisis of 1779 in Ireland. I'll start by outlining the importance of investigating political and other news as a transnational force in the British Atlantic, and then demonstrate how this line of inquiry can provide a fuller picture of transnational events trapped in national narratives through a reading of Irish, American, and British newspapers. So in thinking about how the news became transnational, one would perhaps think it odd to turn to Anderson's Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origins and Spread of Nationalism. And indeed, this has been referenced multiple times, and I'm sure we're all familiar with it. This because Anderson's incredibly influential description of the rise of print capitalism, which focused particularly on the newspaper, came packaged in a larger interpretation of the evolution of early modern communities into their modern national forms. Anderson's account simultaneously illuminates aspects of this process and obscures others. In his account, he described the ways in which the periodical form of print facilitated the formation of imagined communities, shared conceptions of identity in representing the world through a medium that would be read by those communities at a similar time on a regular basis. In this way, the press could offer a kind of synchronized communal narrative, and its act of continually representing a common but also constantly changing world introduced newly imagined, constructed identities, and at the same time reinterpret old ones, allowing them to gain new features, be strengthened, or wither away. The influence of Anderson's account has been felt in a number of fields, and rightly so, but the sweeping interpretive nature of Anderson's approach resulted in certain complexities being left undefined or neglected. This neglect is understandable due to the proportions of these changes and the shifts in consciousness and behavior he set out to describe. However, less nuanced readings of imagined communities and prevailing practices of national historiography have led in certain cases to reductionist national interpretations of the past. In the American case, this led to a tenuous exercise of searching for the roots or causes of an American revolution. On the other hand, in Ireland, the pursuit of a national past led to the raising of a patriot pantheon that included 18th century figures who may not have assumed an Irish identity at all. The danger being that these reductionist approaches to and investigations of national identity and national narratives may result in these identities being read further back into the past than they necessarily appeared and were adopted in reality. In this way, I would suggest that national historiographies that have emerged over time with the development of the nation state, corresponding inventions of national traditions and a national past, have obscured the process by which a shared imperial culture developed in the British Empire in the 18th century, one in which Anglo-Irish and Anglo-American settler colonial populations dominated. This is only made more confusing by the fact that this shared culture was expressed in different ways by different peoples in different locations, but nonetheless it is identifiable through a reading of the development of an 18th century press in each context and the analysis of how this press helped to expand a British or an imperial public sphere outwards from London. A narrative of the development of this British press in Ireland and the American colonies in the 18th century is complicated by the fact that even as much of its content was taken directly from metropolitan sources and newspapers, it was also gradually infused with a distinctiveness derived from a variety of factors, including the place in which it was reproduced, the printers doing the reproducing, and also eventually their own producing, as well as the contingency of events. This was the result of ongoing urbanization, as the growth of cities and towns across empire allowed the formation of new publics. And even as these publics engaged with and reproduced a metropolitan print culture, they also gradually made up their own. This reading of the development of the press from the beginning of the 18th century is something I explore in more depth in my dissertation project, but here it will suffice to say that the expansion of imperial information infrastructure is central to this process, in that it was through these channels of communication that metropolitan print culture could find its way into the hands of individuals, communities, and publics across empire. These ever-expanding and connecting structures of information interchange enabled those outside of the capital to imagine themselves participants in debates originating at the very center of empire. This became even more of a possibility later in the century, when reports of local events of public protest in provincial newspapers began appearing in metropolitan newspapers, and then with metropolitan comment were reflected back on those publics involved through the provincial press in which they originated. So this brings us to our first episode, the Stamp Act of 1765, which was fittingly inspired by the introduction of a tax that threatened the newspapers of the American colonies, or so they claimed. In response, the Pennsylvania Journal, which is pictured here, would print the famous Tombstone edition, which featured crossbones and a coffin on the masthead. The reaction of the colonists to the imposition of stamp duties in 1765 and 1766, as well as the reaction of patriot publics in Dublin and London, demonstrate the power of the periodical news to connect these publics across space through the reporting of events of political significance, though of course with some delay. However, despite this delay, which in the American case was quite significant, the flow of information was constant, which meant a kind of time lag rather than any major dearth or gap in the arrival of news. This offered greater parts of the population in each location a kind of imagined participation or agency in the reported actions of imperial publics, especially in events of protest or reaction to imperial policy, a development which suggests the possibility that the alternate structure of politics that emerged in the 1760s, according to John Brewer, may not have been limited to England. In his account, Brewer explained how the Stamp Act allowed ideas of representation to filter back into a London public sphere through arguments articulated by the American colonist. He claimed that these arguments informed the demands of those groups that strove for parliamentary reform later in the century. In reading British and Irish newspapers, as well as newspapers appearing in the urban centers of the American colonies at the time, one may quickly notice that one avenue for this flow of political ideas was the news, as a common political discourse is readily apparent. On the 8th of February 1766, the London Evening Post, an opposition paper printed thrice weekly, included news of the situation in New York regarding the Stamp Act, and it says on the slide as well, "Such are the unhappy times occasioned by the Stamp Act that scarce any business is carried on, our port is shut, no vessels cleared out, no law, no money circulating, in short, all traffic and trade seems to be at an end. The people of the province seem to have such an aversion to taking the stamp papers that they will sooner die than take them. What the event will be is really to be dreaded." Along with this news report of the deteriorating state of affairs in New York, which I've found reprinted in the London Chronicle as well, the newspaper also described events of a political nature occurring in Boston. However, these same events were given far greater coverage in a Patriot newspaper printed that very same day in Dublin. The front page of the Freeman's Journal was dominated by a series of clippings detailing unfolding events in the capital of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But the paper didn't stop there, also making space for news of political action taken in protest against the Stamp Act in the colonies of Maryland, Virginia, and Connecticut, as well as in the city of Philadelphia, where just 2 days later, a piece of news taken from another Philadelphia newspaper was reprinted in the New York Gazette, referencing the opinion of the people of Ireland. The paper, which stressed cooperation rather than dissension on its cover, carried information shared by a Captain Ashmead from Cork, but last from Cove, which place he left the 12th December. In the reprinted report featuring in the Gazette, the ship captain informed the New York public that the ministry in England held councils twice every week on affairs of this continent, and that the people of Ireland are highly pleased that the opposition the Stamp Act meets with in America, and their general toast are destruction to the American Stamp Act. The three perspectives offered here were printed within a few days of each other, but many miles apart. They're intriguing in the way that they report similar events happening in different locations at different times, but more importantly in the way that they connect these events and describe them in a shared political language. The common political culture this shared language represents would reach a breaking point in 1776 as the Continental Congress issued its Declaration of Independence. If our first episode has gone some way in proving a common political culture and thinking the imperial public sphere whole, through analysis of transnational reports of the Stamp Act, the appearance and reprinting of the Declaration of Independence may perhaps allow comments on the distribution of the news at the time. In London, the Declaration was reprinted first in the London Chronicle on the 17th August 1776, over a month after it had first appeared in the Pennsylvania Evening Post on the 6th July. That was the first American paper to print the Declaration. The newspaper included further revolutionary news carried by a ship arriving in Dublin from Virginia, as well as reports of the strategy of the provincial and British forces brought with other New York papers by Captain Maher arriving at Cork. In Dublin, the Freeman's Journal called the Declaration the best explanation of the rights of the people which has been published this age. While on the same day, the 24th August, the Dublin Journal offered predictions on which side the Native Americans would join in the ongoing conflict, which had really begun in Lexington and Concord in 1775. Just a week earlier, on the 17th August, the same day the Declaration was first printed in London, the New York Gazette and Weekly Mercury recounted the celebrations of the provincial troops at the reading of the Declaration at Ticonderoga in New York, claiming every man's countenance was now, "We are a people, we have a name among the states of the world." On the other hand, the New York Journal referenced comments by the Lord Mayor Sawbridge at the Common Council of London, a constant source of radicalism in that city, in which he moved a resolution asking that His Majesty's subjects in America be continued upon the same footing of giving and granting money as his subjects in Ireland are by their own representatives. Reports of attempted reconciliation and other more gloomy assessments multiplied in the imperial capital and Dublin, but at the same time, the flow of the news in the American colonies was becoming increasingly choked by the war, and the distribution of the news more reliant on fewer sources, especially in those outlets of the American patriots, as evidenced by the overlap of news reports in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia newspapers at this time. Some of these would name Lord Hyde Packet Boat as their source, like the New England Chronicle, but even when this isn't the case, it's easy to identify many of the same reports reprinted verbatim in a number of these papers. These problems with the distribution of transnational news continued during the war years, resulting in an increased delay in certain news appearing in American newspapers, but it did little to limit the American newspaper coverage of the developing situation in Ireland in 1779. Newspapers were quick to compare the beginnings of the Irish free trade crisis to that of the American Revolution. If reports of that revolution, the American Revolution, and particularly the appearance of the Declaration of Independence have allowed comments on the distribution of transnational news, our next episode will perhaps enable us to think about how the investigation of transnational news opens up these events that have often been viewed in national isolation to new and wider perspectives. A month after a protest by the Irish volunteers on the 4th of November, 1779, pictured here, the painting by Francis Wheatley of the volunteers in College Green. And only a few weeks after a popular protest that rocked the Irish House of Commons, the British Parliament and Lord North would concede to Irish demands for a free trade. The view of the Dublin Evening Post appearing on the 9th December, the same day the concessions were announced in London, newspapers is undeniably transnational. Had not these associations taken place, or had not America been humbled to an unconditional submission to Britain, our application for a free trade would probably have been heard as a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. The situation dominated the newspapers of the metropole that month, with the London Evening Post weighing in on the imperial crisis. Let it teach us wisely to grant Ireland all she asks, a trade free as the winds of heaven, for once at least profit from experience by letting her seem to receive from our justice what otherwise she will force from us by the sword. This obvious reference to the ongoing conflict in the American colonies allows us to reflect on the reporting of the event there. The Independent Chronicle, a Boston newspaper, reprinted an account of the volunteer protest first appearing in the Freeman's Journal, with a few discrepancies, the most notable being the famous signs they had placed on each side of the statue of William IV in College Green, the last of which had read in the original print, the Freeman's Journal, the second one there, a free trade or else, blank question mark. Instead, it was rendered as a free trade, if not, blank question mark. I'll leave it up to you to decide which is more threatening. The news of the concessions of the British Parliament arrived around St. Patrick's Day, and celebrations and toasts to the Irish were reported in the Pennsylvania Journal, the New York Gazette, and elsewhere in the month of March. The news was also greeted with curiosity and conjecture as to what the Irish response would be, with the Connecticut Current, claiming on the 14th March, under their protection, the Commons dared to speak in a language of an independent nation and voted solemn thanks to the companies of the Associated Volunteers, whereas the New York Gazette offered a much more dire analysis of hopes for an Irish Republic in writing of the exhausted hopes of the Republican politicians. So these three episodes have served several purposes. In the first, a common political language and culture was identified, which allowed us to think of the imperial public sphere as a whole. In the second, that sphere was fractured as the Continental Congress severed ties with the British Empire when it issued its Declaration of Independence and declared war, a war that would to some degree strangle the flow of information and transnational news. In the third, the Irish free trade crisis allowed us to analyze the transnational nature of news reports and investigate how newspapers distilled and shaped transnational perspectives of political events and the imperial crisis. By bringing transnational news of revolutionary and other events to greater numbers of people and wider publics in urban entrepôts in Ireland and across the British Empire, the newspaper allowed increasing informational exchange and facilitated the emergence of new identities and new conceptions of the place of the individual and the ethnic, religious, and national community in the world. While questions remain, including how individuals were reading the paper, who was reading the paper, and indeed who was excluded from the discourse of the news. And these are questions I look forward to exploring in more depth when archival research becomes a possibility again. It can clearly be said that the news and information more generally was not broken into national parts, but rather passed through webs of sociability, information networks, institutions of empire, and less formal structures of trade and commerce. Thus, the need to reassess events from a transnational perspective and investigate the impact of transnational news is integral to historical studies going forward. And on that vein, perhaps it's even worth hazarding a brief comment on the current crisis and thinking about the histories that we've written of this period and how they will utilize the news of this global pandemic as a source. Will these histories cater to national concerns and interest or think about broader transnational themes? Of course, both of these avenues will be taken, but hopefully one not at the expense of the other, as has been the case in the past. Thanks so much, and yeah, I look forward to any questions anyone has. Thank you. Stop my screen share, sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Joel. Another fantastic paper. I'm just taking notes here. Excellent timekeeping as well, which is very much appreciated, which brings us on to our final speaker on this panel, and that is Dr. Brian Wallace, who's a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the John Rylands Institute at the University of Manchester. And Brian's paper examines Victorian imperial sieges and the conscription of public opinion. So Brian, I'll just invite you now to the virtual podium and you have the floor.
Excellent, thanks Mel, and thank you for putting together such a great panel and conference, and I hope my timekeeping is as good as Joel's. Let me see, I hope you are all seeing the PowerPoint now. So, in early December 1857, an indignant Londoner wrote to the Times to complain about a new menace on the city streets. He warned that mendacious itinerant newspaper vendors were peddling old editions of the daily papers in the streets around St. James's Place, with loud, false cries claiming that they were breaking news from India, melancholy news from India, defeat of General Havelock at Lucknow. Now, from the vitriol of the letter, it's easy to imagine that this letter writer had bought one of these falsely advertised papers himself and was experiencing some buyer's remorse. However, he insisted that his real concern was that false news like this being shouted around the streets might injure the health of delicate ladies who were awaiting tidings of relatives who were engaged in the conflict in India. These opportunistic street hawkers were capitalizing on an intense public interest and anxiety aroused by the Indian rebellion, which centered on the besieged garrisons of Lucknow. Sepoy troops across northern India had rebelled against their East India Company officers in early summer, being joined in many areas by local nobles and the wider population. And since the end of June, the British soldiers and civilians in Lucknow had been beleaguered in a barricaded neighborhood of the city centered on the British residency. The tenor of metropolitan public feeling in these months was described in familiar terms by a columnist for the Illustrated London News, who wrote, "The accounts from the East by the last mail left us very much in the condition of feeling which the terminations of the monthly pages of the serial works of our best modern novelists leave their readers." Sieges like Lucknow were the defining imperial military encounter for the British public in the second half of the 19th century. Britain's most serious imperial conflict, the Indian Rebellion, its most famous and controversial imperial hero, General Charles Gordon, and its most spectacular outpouring of public imperial sentiment, the Mafeking Relief celebrations of 1900, were all connected by this common thread. My broader research has traced how siege narratives attained this status for Victorians, with their life or death stakes. Siege's spectacle of outnumbered white Britons surrounded by foreign, typically non-white enemies was inherently dramatic for contemporaries, and it became an increasingly frequent story in an expanding but frequently undermanned empire. The mixed military and civilian garrisons drawn from across the United Kingdom also made sieges a very relatable form of imperial warfare for the home public, the sites for a four nations patriotic discourse. In journalism, serial fiction, theatre, poetry, arts and songs, audiences were encouraged to imagine themselves besieged. How would you cope with weeks or months of shell fire, limited rations, isolation and uncertainty? More than this, though, these siege stories held special resonances for an island nation with a traditionally insular, defensive self-image. The garrison could be imagined as a microcosm of its island homeland, with white cliffs replaced by sandbags, replicating in miniature its magnificent beleaguered isolation, its social hierarchies, and its patriotic virtues. By conflating home and imperial defense, sieges helped to justify and popularize an imperialism which could often be controversial. So in this paper, I'll focus on the role of the press in reporting sieges, in generating a shared sense of common peril and mission between the home public and the besieged garrison, and in conscripting public opinion in support of imperial wars. To illustrate these points, I'll look at two episodes, the Siege of Lucknow in 1857 and the mission of General Gordon to Khartoum in 1885. The story of these events and their reception on the home front is entangled with the development of the 19th century British press, from the birth of war correspondence in the Crimea to the campaigning journalism of figures like W.T. Stead, and the emergence of populist mass-market newspapers like the Daily Mail in the 1890s. Tracing the impact and reception of imperial sieges through the press can shed light on the question of newspapers as mirrors or makers of public opinion, and on the metropolitan impact of empire. And I think it can demonstrate how popular imperialism could often be expressed not as a strictly defined creed, but as a reflex touched off by external events. So to begin with 1857. As the first reports of sporadic sepoy mutinies began to trickle back to Britain in the early summer, much of the coverage had the same critical tone which had characterized coverage of the recently concluded Crimean War. The press and public were quick to see the mutinies as judgments against the incompetent nabobs of the East India Company. The Times condemned the company's succession of follies, while the radical Reynolds newspaper went still farther and declared the sepoys to be righteous and justified in resisting the same upper-class oppression which kept down British working men. It was the serialized spectacle of the rebellion's sieges which decisively shifted this mood. Now, news from India took an average of 6 weeks to reach Britain in the late 1850s. The Times at the time was the only paper to maintain Indian correspondence prior to 1857, and so it formed the wellspring from which early reports were circulated throughout the press. And this could be a bewildering picture. Brief, often quite cryptic, telegraphic news stories arrived and were printed days before the full reports, alongside official dispatches, general orders, personal correspondence, and editorial speculation. Among the besieged garrisons being reported in this manner was the Ganges River military station of Cawnpur, whose commander had been issuing optimistic dispatches, insisting that although their defenses amounted to little more than a mud ditch, he was confident that the rebels would soon tire of the siege and march off to Delhi. This optimism made the shock all the worse when, on the 28th of August, the Times confirmed that the garrison had in fact been killed during a retreat after a negotiated surrender. Fabricated atrocity stories began to emerge in the following days of women being sold to rebels in the bazaar or children being tortured in front of their parents. These assaults on British domesticity sparked a wave of horror and calls for wholesale vengeance against the Indian population, which filled the editorial columns and letter pages. Not all were convinced by these lurid stories. In a private letter, Benjamin Disraeli speculated about the extent to which such atrocity stories had stimulated subscriptions, as it certainly has the warlike passions of the people. For many, however, the uncertainty of these tidings only enhanced their emotional involvement with this story haltingly unfolding in the press. At the nearby garrison of Lucknow, with its mixed civilian and military garrison, all able-bodied men had been drafted into civilian militias, and reports emphasized the resonant images of merchants, teachers, clerks, and schoolboys taking up arms, while well-bred ladies nursed the wounded soldiers. The sporadic dispatches detailing the garrison's status and the progress of the relief column under General Henry Havelock were followed anxiously in the daily press. Contradictory reports only added to this tension. On one occasion, in the same two columns, dispatches from different ships declared the garrison to be either safe or desperately short on provisions and about to fall. Filling this void of uncertainty was a lot of editorial speculation on the details of each mail. The details of Havelock's march were reported and analyzed with all the drama and verve of a race meeting. In all these letters and opinion pieces, I think we can see echoes of what Stephanie Markovits has called the participatory journalism of the Crimean War. The idea that the press was opening up new avenues for the public to feel they were lending a hand to the war effort, in everything from public subscriptions to simply staying informed and feeling a sympathy for the troops at the front. Havelock's forces reached the Lucknow garrison on the 25th of September, reinforcing it but not succeeding in relieving it. This would be left to another larger relief force now approaching under Colin Campbell. The news appeared in British evening editions on the 11th of November and was pasted up in newspaper offices' windows across the country for the edification of the crowds who had gathered outside awaiting these dispatches. And in its lengthy article celebrating this relief, the Times declared that the existential threats of colonial warfare and the traditional national virtues opposed to it, endurance, intrepidity, and determination, made the rebellion and its sieges a conflict in which Britons across the class and political spectrum could enthusiastically participate. In this patriotic discourse, the role of Scottish troops was especially emphasized. Havelock's Highlander troops had spearheaded the advance, and a popular report which circulated in the British press in early December told how a humble Scottish soldier's wife, Jessie Brown, had been the first to hear the distant bagpipes signaling their approach. This tale was endlessly reprinted and commentated upon in the national and regional press, inspiring ballads, artworks, poetry, theatre, and serial fiction. Reynolds Miscellany, the sister periodical to the radical Reynolds newspaper, even cast Jessie as a rifle-wielding action heroine in a serial story. She was a working-class heroine, you can see on the bottom left there. And in casting a working-class heroine, it allowed this periodical to indulge in imperial adventure despite its anti-imperialist politics, reconciling in fiction these tensions which existed in its news coverage. The long suspense over Lucknow was finally ended on the 23rd of December, when a telegram arrived detailing Campbell's fight through the city and relief of the residency. To hear the press tell it, this was a feat by which Campbell had saved not only the garrison, but Christmas itself. Thank God for that, is the word that will ring from the end to end of England, the Daily News declared. Even anti-imperialist critics, like Reynolds' newspaper, felt compelled to express profound satisfaction at the relief. Although invoking Campbell's identity as a middle-class career soldier, the leader writer did acerbically remark that Britain was lucky to have competent plebeians abroad to sort out the messes created by its incompetent ruling classes. Looking back on this period of shared national anxiety generated by Lucknow, one reviewer would recall, all England, in a manner, was present at that siege. All England, severed by so many feuds, political or religious, cherished a common trust and offered up a common prayer for that city. All England in heart battled, despaired, was relieved, and put on mourning on account of Lucknow. Following the twin sieges of Cawnpore and Lucknow through the columns of the daily press helped to create a popular vision of imperial sieges as sites of national unity across political, class, and national boundaries. The spirit of Lucknow became a common Victorian phrase incorporating ideas about civilian endurance and long-suffering virtue. In fact, many of the elements which would be wrapped up in the spirit of the Blitz in the 20th century. This spirit of Lucknow would become a particularly useful past in the last 2 decades of the 19th century with its more active and interventionist imperial policies. Disraeli had scoffed at the sentimental myths which were emerging from India in 1857, but in 1879 his government would deflect criticism of its own wars in South Africa and Afghanistan by directing focus to the sieges which were the most famous episodes in these conflicts, the sieges of Rorke's Drift and Kabul. These new imperial adventures were all contextualized and justified with reference back to Cawnpore and Lucknow, associations which elevated them beyond the scrum of political debate. These popular siege narratives, which conscripted sympathy and support for besieged garrisons, could be deliberately adapted by imperialists both on the spot and in the metropolitan press, as the next case study shows. This is one of the most iconic images of Victorian imperialism, George William Joy's General Gordon's Last Stand. In this section, I'll trace how Gordon and his allies in the press weaponized the siege narratives which emerged from 1857 in order to mobilize public opinion and direct pressure on the government to intervene in the Sudan. In 1884, Britain ruled Egypt, in fact, if not in name, and Egypt ruled the Sudan, the vast southern territory with its capital at Khartoum. A religious revolt led by Muhammad Ahmed, the Mahdi, rendered the Sudan impossible to hold for the impoverished Cairo government, and the British government demanded that Egypt withdraw its garrisons. Gladstone's government felt some responsibility for overseeing this withdrawal, but didn't wish to be drawn further into Africa, repeating expansionist policies it had condemned under Disraeli. But there was a solution at hand, and it was one provided by the press. The journalist and editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, W.T. Stead, had recently pioneered investigative journalism in his work on London slums, and he found his next cause celeb in the Sudan crisis. J.O. Balin has traced how Stead was directed to Chinese Gordon by the liberal fixer Reginald Brett and a cabal in the War Office who opposed abandoning the Sudan. On the 9th of January 1884, Stead published a widely trumpeted interview with this famous veteran officer, offering his opinion on what should be done to retrieve the situation, and accompanied by an editorial demanding that Gordon himself be sent out at once, Chinese Gordon for the Sudan. The cry was taken up throughout the press, and within a few weeks, the Gladstone government had bowed to this pressure and sent Gordon out with vague orders to supervise the evacuation. General Gordon was an easy hero to promote in the press as the right man for this job, with a career of commanding native troops in China and fighting slavery in the Sudan, all burnishing his reputation as a Christian warrior. However, he was also eccentrically religious, fatalistic, and impulsive, as it turned out a poor choice to enact the evacuation policy, which he would later derisively term the skedaddle program. Shortly after arriving in Khartoum in February, he decided that his orders required him not only to evacuate the Sudan, but to leave behind a stable successor regime, which would require sending in British troops to defeat the Mahdi. Gladstone was appalled by this degree of mission creep and refused to send relief, while Gordon refused to leave Khartoum without it, insisting that he would rather die than leave his post. Despite his unworldly reputation, Gordon was an adroit media figure who proved surprisingly adept at self-promotion. One of his first acts on reaching Khartoum was befriending the Times correspondent Frank Power, and Gladstone despaired at his too free communications with journalists. Even as he bombarded British officials with demands for relief against the encroaching Mahdist forces, Gordon was also calculating precisely when his appeals ought to reach the front pages of the London press. In his posthumously published journals, he made populist appeals to the character of the British people. Writing on the 13th of October, "We are a wonderful people. It was never our government which made us a great nation." This entry was accompanied by a cartoon in which Gordon sketched a protesting Gladstone being pushed reluctantly towards the Sudan by figures representing the British public press, the Daily News, the Times, the Standard, and the Pall Mall Gazette. He was not alone in his belief that public pressure would demand a relief force. As early as April 1884, General Garnet Wolseley had warned the government in a private letter, "The English people will force you to do this, whether you like it or not." The public agitation which mounted over the following months included heated debates in Parliament, mass indignation meetings, and even a subscription fund intended to hire a private army. When Gladstone finally conceded and a relief column was dispatched up the Nile, it was accompanied by swarms of special correspondents and war artists feeding the public appetite for a new relief of Lucknow. But unlike Lucknow, this relief column arrived too late, and when rumors of the fall of Khartoum and the death of Gordon began to reach Britain around the 5th of February 1885, they prompted intense shock and anger. As in 1857, the failed defense was described by commentators as an occasion of national unity across classes. One London correspondent noted that the agitated crowds gathered around the newspaper placards included many of the class of persons who on ordinary occasions would not have concerned themselves with public news, more especially in foreign parts. In his introduction to Gordon's journals, the editor and conservative activist A. Egmont Hake declared his hope that they would be read eagerly by the working classes and would help to dispel the widespread misconception that Gordon had disobeyed his orders. In all of this, it's possible to discern the hope that Khartoum, with its popular hero and clear moral imperatives, would prove an imperialist education for working class population, which might win them away from Gladstone's creed of foreign non-intervention. The national unity narrative, typical of imperial sieges, was here sharpened into a partisan weapon, and the patriotic audiences and readers who imagined themselves standing next to Gordon on the palace roof in Khartoum were encouraged to see not just the Mahdi through their telescope, but the detested Gladstone and his anti-national followers. So I'd like to conclude by briefly skipping forward in time to these famous scenes at Mafeking Night in London in May 1900. When crowds thronged into the streets to celebrate the relief of the besieged town in South Africa during the Boer War by dancing, singing, getting drunk, and waving tiny flags. As the conservative press gleefully noted, even the anti-war liberal statesman John Morley on this occasion made a speech praising Baden-Powell and his garrison, proving that there could be no two opinions on this siege, however one felt about the wider war. However, with a little more distance, the very kind of fervor and energy of these scenes began to seem a little regrettable and even un-English to some commentators. In June, the Anglo-Saxon Review posed the question, could Frenchmen or Irishmen or Italians have given vent to their feelings with more vehemence than the London public during that memorable Friday, Saturday, and Sunday? The responsibility for this worrying exuberance, they declared, lay with the relentless output of the modern press, getting on the nerves of the home public who stay at home and read the newspapers 4 times a day. In this paper, I've attempted to trace how the long communal experience of following imperial sieges through the daily press not only got on the nerves of the home public, but created an intense sympathy and identification with besieged garrisons. And in doing so, they helped to fashion a cultural common sense in which aggressive imperial expansion could be reimagined as simply holding the fort, and critiques of imperial policy could be damned as betrayals of these far-flung garrisons. The cross-class and four-nations unity invoked on these occasions was always exaggerated and limited, of course. Private soldiers died of malnutrition in Lucknow while their superiors hoarded food, and Irish nationalists offered up cheers for the Sepoys, the Mahdi, and the Boers in turn. On a broader scale, though, their defensive nature made these imperial sieges a uniquely morally palatable form of imperial warfare for contemporaries who might have been uneasy over the merits of imperial expansion. And these same qualities have made them powerful sites of memory for imperial nostalgists even into the 21st century. Refracted through the memory of the 1964 film Zulu, the Siege of Rorke's Drift remains one of the most famous battles in British history, with a whole cottage industry of books, models, tours, and documentaries. News stories still regularly appear in the print and online press about the rediscovery of the graves of Rorke's Drift privates, parades and commemorations, goodwill tours, or sales of Victoria Cross medals. In this case, at least, the Victorian Imperial Siege still sells newspapers or generates clicks. Thank you.
Apologies, I just couldn't find the unmute button. So thank you very much, Brian. Excellent timekeeping again, and another fantastic paper, and I'm sure there will be plenty of questions in the chat. If I could just offer a few remarks after hearing those 3 excellent papers. I think, Chris, I was struck in particular by the importance of public opinion in warfare, and especially this idea of, if you like, the conventions of warfare. And the idea of the foreign enemy, breaching those conventions. And of course, this is very different to the situation as it would have been, 50, 60 years previously. And especially as we saw, in Brian's paper at the end there, talking about, mobilizing public opinion more or less behind sort of an imperial idea, colonial warfare, whereas you're talking, of course, about mobilizing revulsion against a foreign aggressor. And of course, I was also on the flip side of that then struck by the idea of the cartoons, and their value to the historian on account of the immediacy of the cartoonist's work in terms of reconstructing that message through the press. Joel, again, another fantastic presentation. We heard a lot yesterday in the panels about Benedict Anderson, and I thought it was very interesting, this idea of reassessing through the lens of transnational history. That was the key point that you made in your presentation. And you also made, of course, an intriguing point about this idea of a shared political language, shared political culture across the imperial world during the 18th century, and how it's sort of obscured by this focus on, I suppose, the national imagined community, national historiography, national history. And then, of course, you also looked then at the fragmentation of that during the American Revolution. And of course, then as well, you touched on the free trade crisis in Ireland. Brian, as I said in my remarks there on Chris's paper, fascinating just to see the sort of the difference, over that period of time to the First World War period that Chris was looking at in his paper. And of course, You mentioned about the sort of national cross-class unity. You mentioned about, I was struck by Charles Gordon and, you know, his, how media savvy he was in terms of that relationship with the Times. As well, I was struck as well because, you know, in some of my own work over the years looking at the 1920, 1921, and you could kind of see in the British press that there was a sort of a lack of a unified public opinion with regard to Ireland. So I'm just kind of struck by that. So I'll just open it up now to the delegates, to the questions. I think we have a question in the chat. So I'll just have a look in the chat. Okay, so for Brian, we have a question for Brian from Rachel Beck. Do you think Brexit has contributed to the remembering of imperialist sieges like Lucknow and Mafeking?
Thanks, Mel, and thanks, Rachel. I think the real kind of imperial siege, which functions as a kind of a site of memory and almost as a proxy for all of this earlier sort of half-remembered, mostly forgotten imperial history, by this stage is Rorke's Drift. And it's because of the film Zulu, which is obviously a kind of a British cinema classic, which certainly everyone of a certain generation has seen. And I think it becomes an entry point for kind of an interest in that kind of imperial history. But it has a sort of image as well as being this kind of fair fight. This is generated by the film between two kind of teams who are sort of mutually respectful. So it's a rather sanitized microcosm of imperial warfare, and as such, I think it's one that nostalgists like to revive and to talk about and to kind of publish endless news stories and retrospectives about. I think the culture wars generated by Brexit in the UK are starting to kind of, you know, obviously sweep up imperial issues like this, imperial statues. I think one of the latest proposals is that every soldier who ever won a Victoria Cross should have a statue erected of them in their hometown, because clearly what Britain needs is more imperial statues. So I feel like the kind of sort of energy around that and the commemorative energy is probably focused on Rorke's Drift, and it's a sort of an easy culture war target to whip people up on, because it's something that has some familiarity based on the film. So
good, thank you, Brian. So we also have a question here from Brendan Dooley.
Just, I'm going to whittle my question down to simply a short comment because of time constraints, and that is just in relation to, or thinking about the our discussions yesterday, also in regard to the earlier periods of the press. Some of the constant concerns that come up and the questions that are specific to media history. For instance, the issue of the of papers of sort of news media as mirror or maker. This is a huge question because very often we have an abundance of the productivity and a paucity of what seem to be direct references to what's going on, and as a result of that productivity, although we can say, well, a public demonstration in the streets is a sign that people have got some news that has disturbed them, and so there you have an impact. But I like Chris Williams and Brian Wallace's inference that the cartoons and the articles themselves are in a way, a mirror of opinion. They do show the emotions, and they do show a sort of immediacy, and they are I mean, the writer or the artist are a special public in themselves, and so obviously they too reflect as well as creating impact. That was it.
Okay, very good. We have a question from Maria as well.
I've responded to that, Mel, in the chat.
Okay, very good. Sorry, I just see that there. Okay, Katrina, you have a question.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed the panel, and particularly the last paper, Brian. I was interested in this notion of siege and how it seems to capture the imperial imagination, and whether that might be because the condition of the imperial metropole always is potentially one of siege, that to enter into the imperial relationship is putting oneself at risk of siege. And I wonder if that's something that plays out. So it's not just the particular sites of Lucknow and so on and Mafeking, but it's the fact that they're reflecting back something of the volatility and instability of the imperial condition. But my question is actually for Chris, if I may. And so you looked at Punch and Simplicissimus and various other cartoons of the period. And I'm really interested in the representation of gender relations there. So you mentioned that the stoicism of women on the home front was demonstrated in some of these cartoons. There was also the wonderful one of the very sort of opulently dressed couple, where the woman is saying, "Oh, please, dear, don't do anything to provoke it." So here she's clearly thinking that a zeppelin is a kind of wild animal while he goes for his gun, and that's the humorous element. But obviously this is also a misogynistic portrayal of a woman who cannot understand a new technology of warfare. And do you see, I mean, these cartoons, particularly Punch and Simplicissimus, are famously misogynistic. Is that something that comes through the home front portrayals, this problematic gendered dimension?
Yeah, thanks very much, Katrina. I mean, I guess that cartoon is also mocking the man, in that there's no way he's going to hit the zeppelin with his shotgun either, you know. So, but yes, I mean I think Susan Graysel's work is really important in terms of interrogating the changing dimensions of gender relations on the home front as a consequence of aerial threat. Although I think the altered dimension goes much wider than just the threat posed by zeppelins, because it's also about things like women, of course, stepping into the workplace during the First World War in transport industries, engineering, munitions, and so on. And also rationing, of course, becomes an enormous, or rationing and food shortages becomes an enormous issue, particularly under the impact of German submarine warfare. By 1917, certainly 1917, 1918, when rationing comes in, and the role of the wife or the mother as the kind of guardian of the household food supplies and household budget, and playing a key role in ensuring Britain sort of wins through, is very well addressed in some of these cartoons. So, I mean, I think, yeah, you know, you put your finger on a very important dimension, which is about the representation of gender in popular cartooning. Punch would certainly be, by this stage, at the far more traditional end of the spectrum in terms of British cartoons, tending towards the well, very traditional and somewhat artistically confined, I would say. And you're beginning to see new responses. So I think Will Dyson, I just showed one cartoon by Will Dyson, but some of his work is really artistically challenging and very direct. And also Dyson was somebody with a track record of support for women's suffrage. So he is challenging some of the assumptions around gender relations in the war, although there wasn't a cartoon specifically on the air war that I could use. But yeah, it's a really important point. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. We have two more questions in the chat. David.
Thank you so much for to all the speakers for their interesting papers. I have just brief questions, and I hope it's not the $1 million question. I'll try. So very general for all the three, if they want to answer. What's how many sides does a public sphere, and what is the relationship between rational and irrational? Because it seems to me that war and the experience of war, and also the way it is represented and the way it used to mobilize public opinion, has a lot to say to us. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, I guess, you know, the question was how many sites does a public sphere have, or what was that? Yeah. In kind of my larger study, this is something that I think about in the sense of as these different political structures are developing, you know, you have the kind of the nascent American public sphere. You know, how early can we read that into existence? When does that happen? You know, American newspapers are printing things from metropolitan sources, but also, as I said in the paper, making up their own news and finding their own voice. In Ireland, it's a similar thing. So it's that question of how do we locate public spheres in this way? Are they is it a multi-layered imperial public sphere, or are these multiple sites in which there are public spheres emerging? And how do we locate the public sphere also in relation to power structures and governments? And so you kind of say there's representative assemblies, although very narrowly representative in the American colonies and in Ireland. And so in a way, do we speak of these as separate public spheres in my period anyway? And so in that way, I think it's a very interesting question and one to think about. I hope that answers in some way. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joel. We also have a question from Blaheen.
Hi, sorry, I was having a bit of trouble there. Yeah, my question is really to Chris. I'm an art historian, so I was fascinated by those cartoons you had. And as an art historian, one of the things that we always look at is the gaze. Who exactly are these intended to, or who are these intended for? So I was just wondering, because you had such, I suppose, an array of different kind of takes on things. I was just wondering, who was the intended audience for most of these cartoons?
Sure. I mean, I think the readerships would have varied very, very considerably. So if you're looking at something like Punch, then by and large, I think historians would agree that was probably a predominantly metropolitan middle-class male readership. If you're looking at cartoons that appeared in daily newspapers, then yeah, I guess predominantly male, but nonetheless widespread. The News of the World cartoons that I've looked at reached, you know, very, very large audience. Obviously, media historians would speculate as to the number of times that a particular issue of a magazine or a newspaper might have passed through different people's hands. Some of these cartoons were republished in collections and would have been viewed in a different context. I think the Land and Water Raymakers cartoons, those were appearing in these fortnightly supplements, which were quite expensive. I've forgotten now exactly how much they were, but, you know, I would imagine that would have restricted the readership. So you've got a very, very wide range of possibilities here with these. There isn't a single readership or a single audience, I don't think. But clearly you're moving from moderately wealthy, middle-class, educated readership at one end, perhaps down to a more popular, a widespread audience with some of the newspaper cartoons in particular at the other.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I was struck by that class aspect actually during your presentation. Brian, do you want to respond verbally to the question that Chris posed in the chat?
Sure, I think I can give a quick little response. So, Chris, you asked about the different perspectives raised by other sieges, the British-French siege of Sebastopol during the Crimean War, and then the multinational siege of the international legations in Peking. I would say the big difference there is actually something you touched on in your own paper, the idea of the rules of warfare. So General Gordon had actually been a young engineer officer at Sebastopol, and he wrote a little bit about this in his journals while kind of besieged in Khartoum. The great difference he raised was in the case of Sebastopol, the Russians were facing a civilized enemy. They could rely on the kind of rules of warfare, such as they were kind of understood within Europe at the time, the kind of rules of parley and surrender and parole. These rules were not seen as kind of applying in sieges in the imperial context against a non-white enemy. And you can see this emerging in army handbooks like Garnet Wolseley's Pocket Field Book for Soldiers, when they give guidance on sieges in an imperial context, there is no chance of surrender. You should kind of resist until the last man. And I think this is certainly the case in 1900 in the International Legation Siege. It is seen as a kind of a life or death struggle against an enemy who can't be relied upon to kind of offer these kinds of civilized rules of warfare in response. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks very much, Brian.
Thank you. We might have time for one quick question, if there's another question.
Can I just make a comment?
Of course you can.
As a proud Welshman and historian of Richard Burton, who did the narrative for Zulu, the film Zulu, Stanley Baker, of course, the Welsh actor, was central to that film. There's a Welsh dimension to that film as well, Brian, isn't it? It's not just British imperialists fighting off Zulus. It's a kind of celebration of Welsh soldiers. They sing Men of Harlech at one point during the battle, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. Are we out of time?
Okay. Listen, I think we'll wrap up there. That was a really fantastic session, really stimulating Q&A as well, really enjoyable. I'd like to just ask everybody to join me in offering a virtual round of applause to our three fantastic speakers, very engaging, really enjoyable. So just to note that just in the program, we'll have a short break now until 10:45 when we will reconvene for panel 6. So we can just all tot off and make ourselves a cup of coffee or whatever, whatever we have at home. So listen, thank you all again to our three speakers, and we will reconvene at 10:45.